The committee will come to order. We welcome our USTR, Jameson Greer here today for the annual hearing on the President's Trade Agenda. Members and the public have questions and concerns about recent tariff actions, and that's okay. We should think about tariff impacts and ask questions. Thoughtful and respectful debate on these issues is good and is why we call hearings like this one with the U.S. Trade Representative. And again, welcome. We need to think strategically about tariff policy, including how to minimize unnecessary costs on American families. I also recognize that although it is easy to see the costs arising from tariffs, it's also far more difficult to assess the cost of denied market access opportunities. Tariffs can advance American interests in market access. In the first Trump administration, we saw tariffs used to stop France from imposing discriminatory digital service taxes. Tariffs also forced China to discuss the systemic challenges between our two nations. Frankly, every enforcement action, whether it's a WTO dispute, a Section 301 investigation, or a preference program review, ultimately relies on the threat of tariffs to secure objectives. Accordingly, it's important to contextualize the tariffs in the design of the larger policy. The real headline then becomes the fundamental shift in trade policy since President Trump's inauguration, where the United States now actually plans to do trade again. My colleagues and I in Congress want to pursue a real trade policy. That was put on hold during the Biden years. We now have a president who will partner with us in that effort, and together we will enforce our rights, we will negotiate again, and we will expand opportunities for Americans. This administration is not deliberating endlessly over whether trade can be a force for good, like the past administration, which refused to even engage in bipartisan or bilateral market access trade negotiations. Trade today is the centerpiece of our international economic engagement, and we have plenty of substantive trade ideas to discuss. Businesses want certainty from good policies that will continue so that they can invest confidently in prospects that create jobs and wealth. That is one of the primary reasons that I'm working hard to make the Trump tax cuts permanent, to provide businesses with the certainty they need to make long-term investments to drive growth and increase prosperity across all segments of the economy. Contrast this kind of certainty and forward thinking on trade with that of the last 4 years, where the only certainty was that you were going to lose ground because your government fundamentally rejected free markets, free enterprise, and free trade. The last administration turned to industrial policy because it was certain that the free market failed in delivering what government planners believed was necessary for climate and social agendas. Indeed, China's central planners saw their own strategic thinking in the Inflation Reduction Act's approach of bestowing massive subsidies to stimulate investments that the market would not. We can restore faith in free markets by making it easier than ever to do business in America. The President's executive order last week to assist major investors to navigate our regulatory system efficiently is a good start. We plan to do more. The Biden administration provided us with only the certainty that in the face of a foreign government's discriminatory policies like digital service taxes, data localization, or other non-tariff barriers, it would not stand up for its citizens because it believed that the so-called right to regulate trumped the principle of free enterprise. Respectfully, democratic governments do not have rights. They exist to secure rights for their citizens. One immediately welcome change under the Trump administration appeared last week in the USTR's National Trade Estimate. Last year, the Biden administration deliberately cut from the estimate a number of discriminatory measures imposed on America by foreign governments because it sided with those governments over our citizens. This year's estimate is exhaustive because the administration carefully identified all of the ways that Americans lose out in the global marketplace. Finally, the validity of free trade will be seen again. The last administration did not pursue market access in its negotiations. Instead, it demanded governments to undertake a number of social and environmental commitments, even ones Congress did not approve of domestically. Not surprisingly, our partners did not put their trust in such negotiations. While tariffs inherently may be seen at odds with free trade, we must also acknowledge that many of our trading partners deploy barriers that have gone unchallenged for too long. Free trade, by definition, must be reciprocal. We do not have it if others can impose barriers on us unchallenged. Our failure to enforce our rights over the last 4 years lost a lot of ground for us. This cannot continue because what I am certain about is that American goods and services are innovative, high quality, and globally competitive. Senior administration officials say that a number of countries are coming to the table to engage with the USTR. We look forward to hearing about this engagement and the steps toward better opportunities for Americans. With that, I turn to Senator Wyden for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and colleagues, today's hearing on the President's trade agenda begins with American retirement funds, investors, and our economy in purgatory thanks to Donald Trump's plan to hike tariffs to levels not seen since before the invention of the automobile. Prices are continuing to increase. Markets for made-in-the-USA products are slamming shut around the world. The U.S. economy has gone from the envy of the world to a laughingstock in less time than it took to finish March Madness. Through it all, Donald Trump and his advisors have yet to provide an understandable explanation. Any explanation for what his tax hike on the American people is supposed to accomplish. And so this morning, I'd like to focus on one central question. What is the plan? In the last week, the White House has been all over the map when it comes to this question. There is no clear message of how the tariffs were determined, what they're supposed to accomplish, how long they'll be in place, whether they're a negotiating tool or a move to try and cut the United States off from global trade and usher in a new era of 1870s-style protectionism. In the days since Donald Trump announced his tariffs, the President and his advisors have repeatedly changed their stories on all of these questions. Last Thursday, Donald Trump said, quote, "The tariffs give us great power to negotiate," just after Secretary Lutnick and a top economic advisor told reporters the tariffs were not up for negotiation. Then the stories changed again on Sunday when the Secretary of Agriculture and the top White House economic advisor, Kevin Hassett, both said Trump's tariffs were bringing foreign countries to the table, hoping to negotiate new deals to cut tariffs. At nearly the same time, the Treasury Secretary was on TV Sunday saying the tariffs would remain in place for, quote, days and weeks. Asked if the tariffs were up for negotiation, the Commerce Secretary said Sunday, "The tariffs are coming." He announced it, and he wasn't kidding. The tariffs are coming. And yesterday in the Oval Office, Donald Trump said there can be permanent tariffs and there can also be negotiations. So again, this morning, what we want to know is what is the plan? The stock market is up a bit this morning on yet another round of rumors that Donald Trump might not go through with his full barrage of tariffs. Yet this weekend, Donald Trump retweeted a post on Truth Social arguing that Trump is crashing our economy and markets on purpose as a strategy to lower interest rates. Is it possible that's the plan? Tank the economy so wealthy people can borrow money more cheaply? We know that billionaires like Howard Lutnick and semi-billionaires like Scott Bessent won't mind paying more for groceries or gas. It's a drop in the bucket for them. But for families, higher costs are going to get hurt. Higher costs are going to hurt. The nonpartisan Yale Budget Lab predicts the tariffs will cost families $3,800 in the first year alone. In Mr. Greer's confirmation hearing, he argued that economic security leads to strong national security. Our country is getting the opposite with these pointless tariffs. Destroying the foundations of our economy is not only disastrous for workers and families, it makes our people less safe. So you look at Stellantis, the auto company, laying off 900 workers in response to the tariffs. I talked to Pacific Northwest fruit growers who are being told no more American exports, and I hear from small businesses in Oregon that they'll have to pay more for the materials they use to make their products. And I worry that Americans will soon be poorer and face greater threats to our national security thanks to these Trump policies. Is that the plan? Colleagues, I'm going to close with this. The Trump aimless, chaotic tariff spree has proven beyond a doubt that Congress has given far too much of our constitutional power over international trade to the executive branch. It is time to take that power back. On a bipartisan vote, 51 senators sent that signal last week by stepping in and passing legislation to lift Trump's reckless tariffs on Canada. Well, now Donald Trump has slapped tariffs on about 180 countries, and this is a big unforced error that requires a big response. So let me close with this announcement. Today, I am proposing a new bipartisan privileged resolution to end the latest crop of global tariffs that are clobbering American families and small businesses. Members on both sides of the aisle ought to know that this is a call to action, and Congress must step in to rein this president on trade. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. And Ambassador Greer, you may now make your statement.
Thank you. Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee, I appreciate you taking the time today for this hearing. Last Wednesday, President Trump declared a national emergency in response to the large and persistent trade deficit that has built up in recent years. This deficit is driven in part by non-reciprocal tariffs, trading barriers, and other economic policies pursued by our foreign trading partners. The situation is urgent. President Trump imposed tariffs to address this emergency, and these measures are aimed squarely at achieving reciprocity and reducing our massive trade deficit to reshore production in the United States. This national emergency declaration and tariff action is the most significant change in U.S. trade policy since we allowed China to join the World Trade Organization. The American working class, in particular, has suffered concentrated losses from the so-called China shock and other adverse effects of past trade policy and the conditions that give rise to this massive trade deficit. You've heard some of these numbers before. The United States has lost 5 million manufacturing jobs and 90,000 factories since 1994. President Biden left with a $1.2 trillion trade deficit in goods, the largest of any country in the history of the world. The United States' share of world manufacturing output declined from 2001 to last year. In the fourth quarter of 2024, U.S. manufacturing as a share of gross domestic product was the lowest it had been in 20 years. During COVID, we were unable to procure semiconductors to build our cars, or materials for pharmaceuticals and personal protective equipment. During World War II, we built nearly 9,000 ships. Last year, the United States built only 3 ocean-going vessels. Our agricultural trade balance, which historically resulted in trade surpluses for our farmers, was in deficit the last 2 years of the Biden administration and likely will take some time to recover. These are all serious indicators of an economic and national security emergency, and we can't ignore it. One important driver of these negative trends has been unfair, unbalanced, and non-reciprocal trade. This includes the effect of higher tariffs imposed by other countries on the United States, the effect of non-tariff measures that promote other countries' exports and obstruct U.S. exports, and other foreign economic policies favoring overproduction and degrading America's manufacturing capacity. And the lack of reciprocity is an important driver of our global trade deficit and with particular countries. So it's common sense to focus on these indicators. For example, the European Union can sell us all the shellfish they want, but the EU bans shellfish from 48 states. The result is a trade deficit in shellfish with the EU. We only charge a 2.5% tariff on ethanol, but Brazil charges us an 18% tariff. The result? We have a large trade deficit in ethanol with Brazil. Our average tariff on agricultural goods is 5%, but India's average tariff is 39%. You understand the trend here. Our trade deficit, driven by these non-reciprocal conditions, is a manifestation of the loss of the nation's ability to make, to grow, to build. And the president recognizes the urgency of the moment. On the first day of his second term, President Trump issued a comprehensive memorandum setting out his trade policy directive. And over the past 10 weeks, he has executed on nearly all of these priorities. He has tightened tariffs on steel and aluminum. He's imposed new measures on auto and auto parts not made in the United States. And on April 2nd, the president declared the national emergency that we've discussed. And so the president has imposed a reciprocal tariff along with a global baseline tariff to achieve reciprocity with other countries and to drive the dangerous deficit down. And the president's strategy is already bearing fruit. Over the past few weeks, a planned layoff for an auto production shift in Tennessee has been suspended. Another automaker is hiring additional employees and expanding overtime to increase auto production in Indiana. Companies have announced $4 trillion in new investment in the United States. Nearly 50 countries have approached me personally to discuss the president's new policy and explore how to achieve reciprocity, and they've spoken with many members of the administration. Several of these countries, such as Argentina, Vietnam, India, and Israel, have suggested that they will reduce their tariffs and non-tariff barriers in line with the president's policy. And these obviously are welcome moves. Our large and persistent trade deficit has been over 30 years in the making, and it will not be resolved overnight, but all of this is in the right direction, particularly as we start to negotiate with these countries. We must move away from an economy that's based solely on government spending and the financial sector, and we must become an economy based on producing real goods and services that provide jobs for working class and middle class Americans in their communities. This adjustment may be challenging at times, and in a moment of drastic overdue change, I'm confident, I'm certain that the American people can rise to the challenge as they've done before. I appreciate this committee's interest in President Trump's trade agenda. I'm glad we're talking about this. That's created debate. And we may not agree on everything, but I know that you want to do what's best for America. So does the president, and so do I, and we'll collaborate together on this. Thank you again for your time, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yesterday, Secretary Bessent stated that you and he both will lead trade negotiations with Japan. I am very pleased that President Trump has decided to press for market access in this case. I hope we'll see more negotiations that press for zero-to-zero barriers, but could you explain a little bit what is the scope of these negotiations?
Certainly. Thank you, Chairman. So as you know, yesterday the President directed Secretary Bessent and myself to interact with the Japanese. We've already been having several conversations with them over past weeks. So this is not a new development, but we are taking it to a new level. Obviously, we want to have more market access in Japan. For us, we feel like we could have more and better agricultural market access. There are also structural impediments to some of our industrial goods in terms of standards and regulations and that kind of thing. I also think that there are things we can do with our trading partners, things that aren't always purely in the trade sector with respect to economic security, whether it's export controls alignment or investment screening alignment or energy, making sure that our partners are tied up with us with respect to liquefied natural gas and other resources, as opposed to being dependent on other countries that may not be as friendly. And so I think all of these factors will go into these discussions with Japan in the coming weeks.
Well, thank you. And as you indicated in your testimony, you've been approached, the administration or you have been approached by about 50 other countries already. I assume that the objective in these approaches, and I assume that there will be discussions and negotiations with them, but first, could you verify that? Is the objective here to engage in market access negotiations with these countries?
Chairman, as these countries approach us, the idea is that we've had years and years of non-reciprocal access, and it's contributed to these trade deficits. As the countries come to approach us, what we've told them is, if you have a better idea to achieve reciprocity and to get our trade deficit down, we want to talk to you. We want to negotiate with you. And it goes both ways. Sometimes they have exports to us that are driven by subsidies and unfair trading practices. And then obviously they have non-reciprocal treatment on their end where they block our exports, sometimes through prohibitive tariffs, quotas that are not administered in the appropriate way, or other unfair trading practices. So these are the kinds of things that should be targeted. And I don't want to prejudge the negotiations, but if they're able to provide an alternative plan that can further these objectives, I think we're open to that.
Well, thank you. The America First Trade Policy Memorandum rightly tasked the USTR to review China's compliance with the Phase 1 agreement. Under the agreement, China is obligated to purchase more U.S. goods and change basic practices and laws, the so-called structural commitments. The prior administration refused to discuss whether China complied with its structural commitments. And by the way, these were commitments made in response to tariffs in President Trump's first presidency, correct?
That's right.
What is your analysis of China's compliance with the structural commitments that it made in Phase 1 so far?
Our assessment, Chairman, is that in the initial stages of implementing the agreement, China made significant movement to make these structural changes, whether it was with respect to agricultural rules, financial services, or IP. We found during the Biden administration there was little enforcement and little communication, and that the Chinese did not comply with this agreement in large part. I've had a call with my counterpart. I've communicated to him our feeling on this, that they have not complied with the agreement. And I think we're disappointed by this. It's not surprising, but we are certainly disappointed by that.
And now you're engaged to, again, see if we can get compliance.
We will see, right? The Chinese obviously have agency in this. It's not just a matter of U.S. policy. We, of course, welcome and we hope that foreign countries will change their practices to make sure that they're fair. And we look forward to continuing to monitor that situation.
Thank you. The administration has announced it's negotiating an agreement also with India, and it appears already to be yielding results, such as India dropping its digital services tax. Although India has high tariffs, its non-tariff barriers are just as significant, if not more so. Will you try to include commitments on matters such as intellectual property, technical barriers to trade, and science-based agricultural rules to take on those barriers?
Yes, and I have a standing call with my Indian counterpart to address these very issues.
All right, thank you. Senator Wyden.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I saw at page 4 of your testimony, Mr. Greer, you said the president's strategy is already bearing fruit. Well, I can tell you for a lot of Oregonians who have 401ks that are being drained out, that's pretty rotten stuff. And you ought to realize how serious this is for the country. Now, everybody in the administration practically has a different story about the Trump tax hike. So I'm interested in knowing what the story is today. Will higher tariffs go into effect tomorrow as announced?
Senator, yes, they're scheduled to go into effect. We are having negotiations with all kinds of countries at this time. The president's fixed in his purpose. The nature of the emergency that I discussed earlier is not something we can wait on anymore. So we will have the president's plan go into effect, and we're coupling that with immediate negotiations with our partners as they seek to.
So it's not a question of something being scheduled. You're committing this morning that they're going to go into effect.
This is what the president has said, Senator.
For how many countries? I understand it's over 50.
That are negotiating with
Yes.
us. We have about 50 that have come to speak with us, and I'm constantly talking to my counterparts. I have staff right now at USTR meeting with others, and we will have the tariffs in place, and if the other countries can come to an agreement on reciprocal trade, then that's something that the president can consider. I don't want to prejudge the negotiations or the president's decision, but that's what we're doing.
Now, you've said you've been negotiating deals. Foreign countries have already retaliated against our farmers and ranchers and small businesses. How can you commit that negotiations are not just going to stop bleeding, but are actually going to open up markets that the Trump tariffs have closed off?
So, Senator, we've already had many countries, many of our markets, explain that they are not going to retaliate against the United States. And in fact, Vietnam, for example, they've lowered their tariffs already on cherries. They've lowered them on almonds and apples, things I know are important to the Pacific Northwest. And this is exactly the right direction that we want to go in. I look forward to hearing from you what other kind of market access you want as we enter into these negotiations.
What's the status of China? As you know, that's a big market for us in the Pacific Northwest. What's the status of discussions there? I don't see much progress. What I see is it looks like it's going to escalate and escalate some more and hurt our consumers and our small businesses in our part of the world.
Well, Senator, unfortunately, China for many years seems to be choosing its own path on market access. Again, they have agency in this. They elected to announce retaliation. Other countries did not. Other countries signaled that they'd like to find a path forward on reciprocity. China has not said that, and we will see where that goes. I think we need to work with our closest friends to make sure that we have trading arrangements that work. And if the Chinese are open, we'll see what. But they haven't signaled that at all. So I don't think that's in the very near term with China.
I just am concerned that there's no strategy at all. I'm committed. We understand in the Pacific Northwest what the stakes are. To have a smart, tough strategy, I don't see any strategy at all, and you really haven't said much about what the strategy is this morning.
Senator, I appreciate your concern. I want to keep having a conversation with you about this, but I see a distinct difference between those countries who have come to us and they said, we understand your issues, we understand the deficit, we understand your desire for reciprocity, and we want to work with you on this. And the Chinese approach, which has been, we're going to retaliate. We're trying to remedy a situation. We're trying to remedy a situation that's persisted for many years. And it would be wonderful if the Chinese agreed with that and wanted to persist in, work with us on that. But that's not where they are. And the president has recognized this, and he wants to focus on other partners.
Let's talk before my time is up about services. The United States is a services powerhouse, from travel and technology to finance and media. Our services industry account for nearly 80% of the U.S. GDP and 8 out of 10 American jobs. Other countries are responding to Trump's global tariffs by retaliating against American services. Can you explain how your tariff actions aren't putting our services exports at risk like so much of your trade policy?
Senator and Chairman Crapo mentioned this. We had India already pull down a digital advertising tax that affected some of our most competitive tech companies. We're already in conversations with other countries that if they want to have reciprocal trade with us, that's something that we need to consider as well. And we expect them not to discriminate against our services companies. We have some of the most competitive in the world. I agree with you. And to me, that's part of this calculation.
I wrapped up with the services question because it seems to me it's classic Donald Trump. Really good at talking about problems, even saying that there is some reason to go forward, identifying a problem, but pretty damn bad at fixing them. And there's going to be a whole lot of collateral damage in the process if you all continue with these trade policies in services and in other areas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn.
Ambassador Greer, well, thank you for being here today. I know there's been a lot of discussion about tariffs, but would you just briefly discuss non-tariff barriers to trade? In other words, the barriers that countries put up to deny market access from U.S. exports into those countries that aren't tariffs per se.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I have here in my hand a book that's become very popular in recent days. This is the National Trade Estimate on Foreign Trade Barriers, and the Office of the United States Trade Representative puts this together with input from civil society, unions, industry, business, small business. And this is 400 pages of all the non-tariff barriers that you're talking about. Just a few examples. India, huge trading partner, they restrict imports of ethanol for fuel use by using restrictive import licenses. These are the types of border measures that don't sound very sexy to talk about, and they don't make for a great soundbite, but these are the things that actually block our exports, where they have licensing regimes or they have fake science that they use to block our imports.
Lynn, just one example that seems to me to make the point is that our friends in Australia basically have put up barriers to the export of beef from the United States. My state, Texas, happens to produce a lot of beef cattle, and Australia basically denies access to its huge market, but not as a result of tariffs so much as non-tariff barriers to trade. Could you speak to that?
Yes, Senator, and it's always surprising because we have a free trade agreement with Australia, and we would expect that we would have fair and reciprocal trade. Last year, I think we imported about $3 billion worth of Australian beef, and we exported $0 of American beef to Australia. And it's not just beef. Australia also blocks on specious, fake science grounds, the export of fresh and frozen U.S. pork. So it's incredible that they do this. We have zero exports of the fresh and frozen U.S. pork to Australia.
I find it interesting that people express surprise at President Trump's policies when he's been talking about these policies for, best I can tell, for decades, and how unfair trading arrangements are between various countries. And indeed, some of these unfair trading practices have resulted in the deindustrialization of America. We've exported manufacturing to Asia and particularly China and other countries that now appear to be willing to hold us hostage to those supply chains. A few years ago, we passed the CHIPS and Science Act. We worked with Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Ross during President Trump's first administration and later was signed by President Biden, but to bring advanced semiconductor manufacturing back on shore because we recognized that the vulnerability that existed if there was another pandemic, there's a natural disaster, or heaven forbid, a military conflict break out in Asia, we wouldn't have access to these advanced semiconductors that run everything from your cell phone to the avionics on an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. But China has basically held us hostage and continues to use some of these vulnerabilities to our detriment. For example, critical mineral processing. Would you speak to the vulnerability that exists as a result of China basically processing 90% of the critical minerals in the world that are essential for our daily lives?
Yes, Senator, and that figure is always one that gives me great concern, the 90% of the processing. We do have critical minerals in the United States. We have lithium here. We have other critical minerals here. And a lot of it is that China has centralized the processing of minerals, right? We have in the Western Hemisphere, in Bolivia, in Chile, we have all kinds of critical minerals, and that's in our hemisphere. But they get sent to China, they're processed, and they come here, and then if China wants to exercise economic coercion or other practices, they do have a stranglehold on these kinds of things. That's a very dangerous situation to be in. I mean, this is part of the urgency of what we're talking about. And I think as the Trump administration certainly takes action on trade, but also takes action on the environmental side and permitting and regulation, that's an area where we can actually have more of that activity here in the United States, or we can work with our trading partners to try to incentivize production there as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, it's good to see you again. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship of the tariffs that you have put on and rising prices for the American people? What is it the American people should expect to be able to suffer as a result in terms of rising prices? I understand your position is that the long-term gain is worth the short-term pain, but what is that short-term pain going to look like?
So Senator, I think we can look at, I think we should look at history and data for this. You know, it's hard to project what's going to happen with prices, but we know in the first Trump term, the president imposed historic tariffs on China on an enormous amount of goods coming from China. And during that time, inflation went down by 0.1%. During the Biden administration, the historic inflation was not on imported goods or related to tariffs that President Biden put in place. It was related to, frankly, services, healthcare, education, et cetera. So I think there's not really a one-to-one on tariffs and price effects, and so many things go into price. I know you think I'm probably like dodging and weaving on this, but I'm looking at data, sir,
yeah,
and the data shows it's not one-to-one.
I know you're smart enough to know that the likelihood is that prices are going to go up for the American people as a result of the tariffs that you put in place. Do you disagree with that?
Oh,
I mean, when you say that the American, in your testimony, that you expect the American people will bear the burden, or that, and I'm sure they will bear any burden on some level. But what do you think that burden is actually going to look like?
Well, I think the challenges, frankly, are going to be more for companies that are largely dependent on imports from China and Asia, where they have to adjust their supply chains in a quick set of time. Yeah. And the way the tariffs get allocated between the foreign producer and the importer, that's where the majority of
and we have a bunch of those companies in Colorado, and I know that. Osprey Packs, for example, they probably don't want me to mention them, but I will. And in Southwest Colorado would be a very good example of that. I mean, they are very dependent on the supply chain from Vietnam, and they probably are really worried today about what's going to happen, which a lot of people are. I mean, I think one of the things about the situation we find ourselves in is the degree to which we've now created huge uncertainty in our economy, and I'm worried that that is going to result in a lack of investment, capital investment. You mentioned some new investments that have been made in our economy, but I think that anybody who knows anything about the economy knows that uncertainty results in people freezing up, a paralysis, a lack of investment, which is going to make it hard for our economy and may actually provoke a recession. Could you comment on your concerns about that and how you're thinking about that? And I have one more question before I'm out of time.
So Senator, the best way to have certainty is to build in the United States, right? That's the best way to have certainty.
But that's going to take a long, long time. And what's going to happen in the meantime, do you think?
So, Senator, we have, I would say, dilly-dallied for years on this issue. We've done these, broad studies, which are interesting and helpful that we saw come out of the Biden administration.
Right.
But we have to act. I can't sit for 3 years and try to fine-tune something.
I hear you. I hear you say
that.
But you could have made a different choice, which was to strategically target a geography, to strategically target Beijing, strategically target certain industries where, all industries in America weren't affected at the same time. You didn't make that choice. I mean, you're in the midst of having trade negotiations with 90 different countries at the same time by your own testimony, all of whom can make their assessment, I assume, these are sophisticated people, about where the pressure points are on you, where the pressure points are going to come for us to not necessarily get the best deal because we're spread all over the globe negotiating every one of these agreements at the same time, rather than a more strategic approach, which would have had the benefit of giving us, I think, a much greater degree of certainty about where we were headed. Obviously, you made a different choice, and I'm just curious about how you think about your responsibility. How you think about that?
So I would note, and I think it's thoughtful to think about things in this way. If you look at the results of the reciprocal tariff, the Western Hemisphere generally is at the lowest tariff rate. If you look at where we have our largest problems with non-reciprocity and deficit countries, it's mostly in Asia. And so you do actually see pretty strategic outcome with respect to promoting production in the Western Hemisphere as opposed to where we have all this overproduction in Asia that's given rise to our current problems on trade.
I would just say in closing, Mr. Chairman, that's true. What the ambassador said is true, but it still doesn't, I still cannot fathom why we are treating Canada and Mexico, our largest trading partners, basically the same way we're treating Beijing. It doesn't make any sense to me. It makes no sense that we would do it all at the same time like that. And we're going to have to stay on it, which is why some of us have introduced legislation to make sure that Congress begins to take its appropriate role again in making these very important trade decisions. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Lankford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing. You've got a lot on your plate, and appreciate the focus right now on this. Let me come from a perspective of a lot of Oklahoma farmers and ranchers and manufacturing folks and retail folks, and quite frankly, folks that sell to retailers that are in Oklahoma. They've got several questions that they've actually sent to me pretty quickly, so I want to be able to bounce a few of those. The goal of this is to do more trade internationally, that the United States would be able to manufacture here or produce here and sell more internationally, and that we would have that opportunity to have increased market access. Is that correct?
So, Senator, I think that's accurate, because when we're trying to get down a deficit and have more production here, necessarily part of it is making sure we're not getting too many imports that are driven by unfair trade practices, but also promoting our exports overseas.
So then right now there's a lot of negotiations going on. There was a lot of questions for several days whether we're negotiating or not negotiating. I'm hearing from you pretty clearly today. We are open to negotiate. We're trying to be able to establish better trade agreements to be able to move forward. Do you have any timeline on certain countries or places that you have set internally to say we hope to have negotiations complete by this point? Obviously, negotiations can extend as long as they have to, but is there a timeline you're dealing with?
So the president has indicated that he's willing to negotiate with parties that want to pursue reciprocal trade with the United States. We don't have any particular timeline set on that because, as you pointed out, Senator, the outcome is more important than setting something artificially for us. What I can say is I'm moving as quickly as possible, and a lot of these countries are moving very quickly, and we're working on the weekends, we're working at night as folks want to engage on
Great.
this. Now, I will say, I know you want to ask something. The trade deficit has been decades in the making, and it's not going to be solved overnight.
Right, right. Yeah, everyone understands that well, and everyone that I talk to is grateful that we're actually attacking the trade deficit issue and try to be able to bring down barriers to trade. They also want to get a timeline. Let me give you, for instance, I've got an Oklahoma company that several years ago spent millions of dollars to be able to move out of China. They moved into Vietnam for production because literally what they're producing, the parts were not created in America. So they were looking for other places to go. They spent all the money, spent all the time, shifted out of China, got to Vietnam and established there. Now they're saying, we've got giant costs in Vietnam at this point. So they're going to have to renegotiate with every single retailer that they sell to, which is going to take a lot of time to be able to do it. What they're trying to be able to figure out is, do we hold on those negotiations and try to renegotiate with Walmart and Target and Costco and everybody else they're going to have to renegotiate with? Or do they press on with those negotiations now? If things are going to get resolved soon, they can pause. If they're not going to get resolved, they're going to have to renegotiate every contract again to try to figure out which way to go. So the time piece does matter to them.
Senator, I understand completely, and Vietnam is one of those countries that understands that it is, frankly, one of the major targets of this action because their trade surplus with us is so lopsided. I think it's every $15 they export to us, we send them $1, and they remain closed to our exports where we can be competitive, agriculture, et cetera. But they've come to the table with an offer, right? We didn't go out and say, please come talk to us. They beat down our door and they want to talk about it.
Good. I don't anticipate that we're ever going to have equal trade with Vietnam. We're a much larger economy than they are, but bringing down the trade barriers would be helpful so that they would accept American products to be sold there. I think that's beneficial, but most countries in the world are never going to buy as much as we're purchasing because we just purchase a lot more from there. Another issue has come up about garment manufacturing. Obviously, this is a challenge. We'll have different pieces that are bought from different countries. We don't have a lot of garment manufacturing here in the United States. For those garment manufacturers that are here and for others, some in Oklahoma, they're asking me about exclusions and exceptions and how this is going to be handled to say, we can't buy it in America. This is the only place that's actually manufacturing it. I know long-term, the hope is to be able to have a more diversified, but in the short term, they don't have another option. How do you plan to handle that?
Senator, the president has been clear with me and with others that he does not intend to have exclusions and exemptions, especially given the nature of the action. If you have Swiss cheese in the action, it can undermine the overall point, which is to get rid of the deficit, achieve reciprocity. To my point earlier to Mr. Bennett, the Western Hemisphere countries have a much lower tariff than many of the Asian countries, and I've heard from textile manufacturers for many years that they would love to have a situation where Western Hemisphere textile and garment manufacturing is more competitive, and maybe we're setting up the conditions for that.
So in the short term, there's no exemptions that are coming on it. So for companies that are currently buying from Asia at this point, whether it be for textiles, whatever it may be, the goal is to be able to push them out of Asia into the Western Hemisphere, or where do they need to go at this point?
Well, the president has been clear, again, that he's not doing exemptions or exceptions in the near term. My own sense is, given the tariff differentials between Asia and Western Hemisphere, I think people can start making decisions based on that.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Ambassador Greer, for being here. Just to sort of frame our conversation, tell me what a negative externality is.
This is something you and I like to talk about.
Yes, we do.
This is a situation where you have a foreign country where perhaps they have actions such as poor environmental regimes or lax labor laws, and they don't bear the cost of that. Instead, they send their goods that are the product of these processes where they have lax regulatory regimes. They send it here, and we end up bearing this. They externalize these negative externalities to us, and we have to bear it, and our workers have to bear it, and we don't compete on a level playing field.
So two things are wrong with this. One, the customary negative externality is pollution. And to the extent, for instance, on an issue I've done a lot of work on in bipartisan fashion, plastic in our oceans. Now it's in our drinking water, it's in breast milk. I mean, we've really gone down a very weird pathway with respect to plastics. If China, for instance, is responsible for dumping 60 or 70% of the plastics into the Pacific, then that's a harm to us, correct?
Yes, I agree.
Because it's a commons, the ocean, and we suffer from that. And then if the Chinese company is exporting their goods to the U.S., and that Chinese company has a lower cost for its product because it doesn't have proper pollution control with respect to plastic, and the U.S. company does, then that's an unfair trade imbalance, correct?
Yes, I agree with that.
So two things are wrong when we get into the situation of foreign countries allowing pollution that our companies pay to prevent.
That's right.
And that's an appropriate place for tariffs to be deployed to offset that trade imbalance and help protect the commons from this particular tragedy, correct?
I think trade action can be appropriate, and when the president announced his reciprocal tariff regime last Wednesday, he specifically referred to pollution by other countries in his speech. You may not have listened to it, but you may want to go back and listen to that part, because that's very true, and I agree with you.
Well, it might be the only place in which the administration shows the slightest interest in pollution, so good for that. The issue of plastics is, I think, a pretty significant one. Again, there's been a lot of bipartisan interest. I even went up to the Oval Office during Trump 1 to have one of my bills signed by the president, and he gave a very animated riff on Asian countries polluting our beautiful oceans and how it comes ashore very often in Alaska by the ton along their beaches. So I hope this is an area we can continue to work together. And in particular, I hope that you'll sit down with me and Senator Cassidy on legislation that we are working on. Will you give us that meeting?
Senator, I'll take any meeting with you that you would like to talk about this issue. And
Great.
I'd like to
Well,
also
we'll
let you...
sit down with Senator Cassidy's team and have a conversation there. The other thing I wanted to flag for you is that you pretty well successfully deflected all of Senator Bennett's questions about what the immediate impact looks like in the short-term pain for the long-term gain. I just want to flag for you one issue that is very important to me. Rhode Island is a small business state, right? We don't have a whole lot of big mega corporations there who can balance things and move things around. Canada is our largest trading partner. We have companies who fill an important niche in the global supply chain, and particularly in American companies' supply chains, because they get something from Canada, or let's say China, could be, but Canada's our major trading partner, and they process that thing, and then they put it into the supply chain for the larger corporate entities. That's their business. That's all they've got. So if we're not looking out for these small businesses that are actually going to have to lock their doors and close the shutters and fire their employees and go out of business, I think you've missed a huge hole in the problem that these tariffs have created. If all you're listening to is the big mega corporations who can move things around the world and have the resources to dodge these effects, you're not getting the straight story. I think in every one of our states, there are going to be small businesses that occupy a niche in which trade is an important factor and that are going to go bust because of these tariffs. And I urge you to look out for those businesses because I don't think they're getting their voices heard at all.
So, Senator, I've talked to you about this. I've talked to Senator Hassan about this and others. One thing I asked my team to do last week was to convene a meeting of I have I have a trade advisory council for small business. I've asked them to convene that meeting. I've connected with the Small Business Administration. They have an international trade desk there. I have an office that also deals with small business because I do want to hear it. I think it's important that we hear it because they don't have the same voices in Washington. I will say right now, Canada and Mexico, things coming from Canada and Mexico that comply with the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement come in duty-free. They continue to do so if they follow the rules. If they don't follow the rules and are trying to put in Chinese stuff, that's going to be tariffed. But if they follow the rules, they're going to be getting the duty-free treatment they're due.
Well, a small business that has gone broke is not very amenable to a meeting. They don't exist any longer.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. Good morning, Ambassador Greer. Thank you for being here. Before I start with a couple of additional questions about the impact of these tariffs, I want to associate myself with Senator Whitehouse's comments just now about the impact on our small businesses, particularly those who are critical parts of supply chains for some of our larger corporations in the country. As you know, Canada is our biggest trading partner too, and we are already seeing the impact of these tariffs with our small businesses, especially in our tourism industry, which is being decimated because Canadians are not coming down to New Hampshire the way they usually do. Let me ask you about a couple of other things. President Trump's tariffs have made almost everything that families buy more expensive. The president imposed a 10% national sales tax on all imports into our country and an even higher sales tax on imports from more than 50 countries, including our allies like Canada. This is the largest tax increase in over half a century, and it's going to cost the average American family $3,800 a year. Their morning cup of coffee will cost more, so will new shoes for their kids, and so will fresh fruit. So my question to you, Ambassador, is how much revenue from the president's national sales tax will be used to give tax breaks to billionaires?
So, Senator, as you know, any kind of tariff revenue that comes in to the United States government, it goes to the Treasury, and Congress will decide what happens to that money. Obviously, the president wants to have a very competitive tax policy that's good for everybody. That was part of why he had such a successful economy in the first term, is he married trade action with good tax policy to have $7,000 an increase in real wages over that time.
Well,
let's
be really clear. The president, besides the contradictions in the way he talks about the purpose of his tariffs, the president's made very clear that he sees tariffs as a way of increasing revenue. At the same time, he's working with the majority in Congress to give additional tax breaks to the wealthiest people in the country at the expense of working people who are going to be paying more for everyday goods they absolutely have to pay, goods they were hoping were going to cost less given the president's campaign promises. But of course, he isn't keeping to those campaign promises as prices continue to go up. Now, the president's national sales tax is increasing prices for families. It's also causing huge losses in Americans' retirement savings. Ambassador Greer, would the administration reverse course if the president's tariffs led to 10% inflation?
Senator, the president is fixed in his purpose. This trade deficit and the offshoring and loss of manufacturing jobs is something that's persisted for too long, and it's dangerous.
I understand your justification for the policy, even though there are some very contradictory justifications coming out of the administration. But my question is, what's the inflation rate where you guys would reverse course? 10% inflation that I just asked you about, that is higher inflation than we saw at the peak of the COVID economic crisis. But you aren't going to say here today that you would reverse course even if you created inflation as high as we had at the peak of the COVID economic crisis.
I think the most serious inflation we saw was during the Biden administration. When we did tariffs in the first term, inflation went down. I just don't. It's not going to be a one-to-one. Inflation about how much money you're putting into the supply.
Well, let's just be really clear that the Trump administration is here today to say that even if inflation hits Americans' pocketbooks at 10% because of these tariffs, then the Trump administration is still going to go charging ahead. So, Ambassador, would the administration reverse course if the president's tariffs caused a 50% stock market crash, which would hurt Americans' retirement savings even more than they've been hurt in the last 10 days or so?
Senator, the fundamentals of the economy are so strong. We had 228,000 jobs last month. We have 9,000 additional manufacturing jobs from
So
the month
again,
before.
your answer is even if the stock market crashes 50%, which is how much the stock market crashed in the Great Recession, you're not going to say here today that you would reverse course even if you crash the stock market and harm retirement savings as drastically as happened during the Great Recession in 2007.
Senator, your hypotheticals are not consistent with the history we have seen with the use of tariffs.
My hypotheticals are based on the fact that a lot of Americans are looking at their 401ks today and wondering how much of a lifestyle change they are going to have, or whether they're going to be able to retire when they plan to, because of the recklessness and haphazard nature of the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs. Nothing was thought out about this. This has been a haphazard, incompetent effort, and it's showing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy.
Hi, Mr. Greer. Thank you for being here. When I speak to my rice people and my shrimp people back home, they say that the tariff barriers and the subsidies by other countries for those products are so much that it is putting some of our shrimpers and some of our rice people either out of business or in incredible financial binds. And so the fact that the president is attempting to address these as well as the non-tariff trade barriers is incredibly important. Let me first say that. But I also hear from my producers that the mean tariff being selected to apply to a country may not account that for rice, for example, the tariff is much higher for that particular product, and that it is not adequate to address that which is taking place. Any thoughts on that, and how can we have something more particular for products which are really over tariffed?
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate that concern, and the tariff rate applied to many of these countries, again, was a countrywide rate. It wasn't product specific. My sense is if countries come to us and they expect to have some kind of a different plan, they will need to change these things, right? And they will have specific products, specific barriers that they would have to address, right? Or else, the president, again, he's fixed his purpose. He wants to see production back here. He wants to see our agriculture producers doing well. And these countries just have to have reciprocal trade with us. And that means taking care of the types of barriers and tariff rates you're talking about.
So it sounds like you, one of the things I think they want to know is that since shrimp might be a relatively small part of trades with some of these countries, that the interest of, for example, shrimp will not be sacrificed in part of a greater whole.
No, I think, and I saw a really interesting article today in the New York Times on shrimp. You may have seen that, where the tariffs have actually given a bit of a lifeline to these shrimpers. And I think that if there's going to be any kind of change to any of this, and I'm not going to prejudge that, we have to make sure that our industries are protected adequately, so we don't go backwards with the deficit.
Let me ask, in the President's America First trading policy, there's several sections relating to free trade agreements and how they will be evaluated. Senator Bennett and I are working on an America's Act, which would be a hemispheric trade policy, which would have several purposes. One, to strengthen those ties. Secondly, to keep the Chinese from making the incursions that they are absolutely making throughout the hemisphere. Some are calling the Caribbean a Chinese lake. And so this would allow us to push back upon that. Can you share anything regarding the analyses of the free trade agreements we have within our hemisphere, and then specifically on countries like Argentina who would like an FTA with our country?
Certainly. I would say that we are first and foremost focused on addressing this emergency and the reciprocal tariff action and implementing it appropriately. With respect to relations in the hemisphere, any kind of trade arrangements with these trading partners, I think, need to be coupled with strong rules about third countries. What I don't want is a situation where these countries are using, their export platforms to incorporate content and goods from, China or other Asian countries, where we have a real issue with our deficit and offshoring of manufacturing. I would expect any kind of changes to these arrangements to be accompanied by changes in rules of origin to ensure that the United States and U.S. workers are really benefiting from these agreements.
So nothing from an FTA in general, but the specific of where it's being used to circumvent the intent of the FTA is the concern of the administration.
Yes, that's certainly a huge concern. And again, the president wants to see factories back here. The most certain way to not have a tariff is to build your factory in the United States. If people want to use other countries and insist on that, then we want to make sure that they're not using that to arbitrage for higher tariff jurisdictions to use them as an unfair export platform.
Let me ask you this. Louisiana has some of the largest ports in the nation by tonnage. And all the commodities going from the Midwest flow through my state going out to the world. Earlier, USTR proposed imposing like $1 million for every vessel built in China. And I'm told that if the Koreans have a fleet of 50 and 5 of the ships are built in China, then the $1 million would apply to all 50, not just to the ships that are built in China. Now, that would clearly impact a ship coming to the United States to offload. If you will, impact my ports and the ability of our goods throughout the nation to move through the Mississippi. Is USTR going to hang by that or considering modifying that? Can you kind of give us any idea about that?
So to address the lack of shipbuilding in the United States, USTR's proposed actions are just those. They're proposed actions. They're a series of potential remedies that could be used to incentivize shipbuilding in the U.S. They're not all going to be implemented. They're not all going to be stacked. We've asked for a lot of input, and we've had hearing on that. We've collected comments. We've reviewed it. I've met personally with certain stakeholders during that time period, and I think the president will look very carefully to make sure that we have the right amount of time and the right incentives to create shipbuilding here without impacting our commodity exports.
Okay, thank you. I yield.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, as USTR's Chief of Staff in the first Trump administration, you oversaw the negotiation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, and the renegotiation of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, the KORUS. President Trump signed both of these agreements. He called the USMCA a colossal victory, and KORUS a historic milestone. And yet, with President Trump's new blanket tariffs, he is ripping up these agreements with our allies that we negotiated with. Why would any country want to do business with us, much less negotiate a trade deal, if we don't even honor our ongoing agreements?
So, Senator, we are the consumer of last resort. These countries have to sell here. They have, many of them, especially in Asia, have built their entire economies around exporting to us. They're very dependent on it, and that's part of why we have this huge trade deficit. With USMCA, those parties continue to enjoy duty-free treatment for many of the products that continue to comply with the rules that were set out 5 years ago. There's a big concern, Senator, that we did not have adequate other protections to stop the flow, particularly of like autos into the United States.
But there was a process for you to renegotiate that agreement this year. We talked about that in my office. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And it wasn't to do these blanket tariffs, correct?
What we have to address is an emergency, Senator.
That's true. And you should be honest. At least as you sit here, as you were in my office, be intellectually honest. Now, let me just ask this, because this is also true, and I so appreciate my Senator Lankford asking this. Time matters. How long did it take to negotiate that agreement, the USMCA, that you were part of?
We did it at breakneck speed. We did it in about 2 years.
2 years. And now you're telling us you have nearly 50 countries coming to you, approaching you to enter in a negotiation, and you think that you can do that overnight?
India.
Man, you're pretty superhuman here, if that's the case. So let's be realistic. That's all we're asking. Common sense and realism here, Ambassador, as you sit here before us. And let me talk about something else that is really important for my state, and I think this entire country, because this administration is forgetting that we have $1 billion economy when it comes to tourism into the United States. People know Las Vegas. My state is Nevada. We rely on tourism to our state, and now we're seeing an impact because of these tariffs, not just from Canada, but I am hearing from so many that are in the tourism and kind of leisure industry. We are seeing impacts because now this billion-dollar industry of international tourism is having an impact on our economy. And this is a service industry. Let me just say this. I'm kind of offended by your testimony today that says we must accept self-inflicted economic pain, and I quote you by saying, to become an economy based on producing real goods and services. What does that mean? What does that mean to my service industry and every service industry across this country that relies on tourism and travel? That is the backbone, really, of part of our $1 billion economy. What do I tell them? That they just have to suck it up? That they're not really part of this real services? That you have another idea for the jobs that they should engage in? What do I tell them?
Oh, Senator, of course those are real services. The whole,
So what are you doing
whole
about
sentence,
the impact
the whole,
about, what are you doing about the impact of international tourism and now these blanket tariffs having a negative impact? What are you doing to address that?
the whole sentence, Senator, said that we need to get away from government spending as funding our economy and financialization, and we need to move to real goods and services, including the tourism you're talking about.
So
It's
what are you doing
incredibly
to impact the
important.
negative impact of tourism right now?
Well, one thing I'll say is we can't have the status quo, right? I keep hearing that we should have, essentially what I'm hearing is we should have the status quo. We should keep the $1.2 trillion trade deficit that Biden left us with.
I'm asking you,
and I don't think that's adequate.
what are you doing in this administration to address now the impact that you're having with these blanket tariffs, not targeted tariffs, blanket tariffs, on international tourism that is a big impact to our economy? What are you doing to address that?
Well, Senator, as we're talking to all of these countries, we are talking about services. We are talking about making sure that, you know, we can export services to other countries. A lot of those that we export are, you know, we have
Well, let
digital
me say I only have
services,
so
all
much
kinds
time,
of
and
trade.
apparently you're not. So here's what I would like, because you haven't thought about this, and the administration hasn't really thought about it, because I haven't heard anybody talking about tourism. So why don't you come talk to me in my office, and let's talk about and put a plan together, because these blanket tariffs are having an impact on tourism in my state and across the country.
Senator, I'm happy to
instead
come
of
talk
just
to you.
defending it, why don't you just come sit down with some of us and try to address the concerns that we are seeing and feeling in our states that this administration has not taken into account?
I'm happy to come speak with you. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Grassley.
Ambassador Greer, thank you for being here. I've made very clear throughout my public service that I'm a free and fair trader. The Constitution gives Congress the authority to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. I believe that Congress delegated too much authority to the President in Trade Expansion Acts of 1962 and Trade Act of 1974. That said, I support President Trump's agenda to lower tariffs and non-tariff barriers other countries impose on American goods. I support President Trump's agenda to get a better deal from China and other countries for our farmers and manufacturers. In fact, even back in 2003, I sent a letter to the Chinese Minister of Commerce at that time pointing out China's failure to live up to its WTO obligations. And then I went further in 2018 when I was on Senator Daines' Codell. I told top Chinese leaders I made a mistake supporting China in the WTO. That's why during the first Trump administration, I was supportive of President's agenda to get fair trade with China. At the time, I raised alarm bells when tariffs are used. We all know agriculture is usually the first place of retaliation. In response to Chinese retaliation to tariffs, the first Trump administration set up the Market Facilitation Program for farmers, which gave direct payments to farmers affected by the tariffs. This helped farmers weather the short-term impact of trade retaliation. But as you know, farmers still overwhelmingly want to get their money from the marketplace and not from a government check. So far in this administration, we've seen even more sweeping tariffs, with some countries already retaliating agriculture, including China. I have been very vocal in my wait and see approach to these tariffs because I believe President Trump and you, Mr. Ambassador, are using them to get fair trade for Americans with many countries. If that's not the case, level with me. So to help farmers in the meantime, instead of relying on payments from the government, I'm going to give a suggestion that you don't have much to do with, but the administration could move very quickly to increase RVOs on the renewable fuel standards so that farmers get more robust domestic markets for their crops. And one place to start would be where the Biden administration came up short with RVOs, only 3 1/10 billion over a 3-year period of time on biodiesel, to make that 5.3 as far as you can see into the future. That would very dramatically increase soybean prices. So my question to you is, in the medium to the long term, do you plan to turn these tariffs into trade deals to reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers? I support that. On the other hand, if the purpose is to stall on negotiations in order to keep tariffs high for the sole purpose of feeding the U.S. Treasury, I oppose that. So is this administration for trade reciprocity or for Treasury replenishment?
Senator, thank you, and thank you for your years of service on the trade space, and you're one of the deans in this area. It's important to understand the sense of the emergency that we're facing and urgency with the need to reshore and do manufacturing here. It's incredibly important to the president. Yesterday, he stated very clearly that he is happy to engage in negotiations immediately with countries that believe that they can help us reduce our deficit and get rid of the non-tariff barriers and the tariffs that affect that. I think the answer, Senator, is it's going to be country by country. There are going to be some countries where they're not able to address their non-tariff barriers or their tariffs or the deficit fully, and there will be others who I think will be able to do that, and where the president will have the option of making a deal with them. So we're certainly seeking reciprocity. Now, if we have the tariff on a country, there's obviously going to be a revenue effect, but we need to reshore manufacturing, we need to get rid of our agricultural deficit, and we need to make sure that if countries are going to trade with us, it has to be on a reciprocal basis.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Greer, good to see you. You and I have had many conversations about trade. I think my question this morning, though, starts with the consultation that Congress deserves on trade issues from the trade ambassador. And what did the Trump administration do to prepare us, to communicate with us, to tell us about findings as it relates to these emergency orders by the president?
Thank you, Senator. As you know, I find consultation requirements very important, and not just as a requirement, just a matter of good practice. Our staff, the USTR staff, in the past 2 months that we've been in office, have had over 200 formal engagements with staff on the Hill, obviously here in the Senate, also in the House. The day of the reciprocal trade announcement, we had our staff also up here briefing your staff. And we also had the president issue very publicly his America First trade policy memorandum, which specifically said that he was going to look into the trade deficit and the possibilities of tariffs.
So we've wreaked havoc on the economy by having one of the largest drops of the market. We have people's 401 in panic. We have retail organizations like the Retail Industry, National Retail Federation, American Apparel Industry, Outdoor Association, Consumer Technology, Computer Communications Industry, Main Street Alliance, Small Business Majority, all anxious, asking us to do something. And you're saying, well, some people have passed some notes to staff.